Among things that we need to reset is we need to reset our sermon series in the Gospel of Matthew. We've been in the Gospel of Matthew as a church family since December of 2022, and we're coming down the home stretch today. I want to pick up where we left off back before the holidays hit at the end of chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23, verse 37, Jesus, after having gone toe-to-toe since chapter 21 with the religious leaders, with all of their pushback, with all of their arguing, with all of their debating, with all of their rejecting, Jesus now in verse 37 of chapter 23 really closes the door on his earthly ministry among his own people, the Jewish people, at least for a time. And he says, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, yet you were not willing." They've rejected Jesus. That's what he's saying now. You've rejected my prophets. You've rejected my word. Now you've rejected me. And he says, see, your house is left to you desolate. That's a statement of judgment. That's a statement of condemnation. Your house is left now to you desolate, for I tell you, you will never see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So Jesus pronounces doom on Jerusalem and on his people in Matthew chapter 23, and then Jesus begins to tell the future in Matthew chapter 24 and Matthew chapter 25. We're going to jump today to Matthew chapter 26. Now, if you're thinking, Pastor, why are we skipping Matthew 24 and 25? It's because I already preached that to you. We were in our Matthew series, and October the 7th of 2023, Israel was invaded. And for the couple of months after that, I jumped ahead, and we went ahead and took on Matthew chapter 24 and 25. So today, we're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 26. Are you there? You ready? Here we go. Some of you are encouraged, like we're closer to finishing this than I thought. We're all the way to Matthew 26. In Matthew 26, Jesus starts by giving us some clarity about where we are in this, his final week of his earthly ministry. His death on the cross is 48 hours away when we come here to Matthew chapter 26, and Jesus is very clear about that. Matthew 26:1, when Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, you know that after 2 days, the Passover's coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified. Now, he's already told his disciples 3 times explicitly, I'm going to be lifted up, I'm going to be crucified. But here in Matthew chapter 26, he tells them, set your alarms, because we're 48 hours away. He says, in 2 days, the Son of Man is going to be delivered up to be crucified. Look at verse 3. Then the chief priests, all right, there's somebody, they're important, and the elders, they're important. The elders of the people, they gathered in the palace. That's an important place, the palace of the high priest. He's an important person, and his name is Caiaphas. This is no small grassroots uprising against Jesus. These are the power players. These are the elites. These are the people that are in representation of all of the nation of Israel. And verse 4 says they gathered together and they plotted together. They're plotting. They're powerful. They're in charge of so many things. And yet what has caught their attention more than anything else, what they're obsessing over, what they're plotting over, is this carpenter from Nazareth named Jesus. The Bible says that they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth. He's popular, he has a following, so they've got to operate in the dark. They've got to be sneaky about how they go to arrest Jesus and kill him. Verse 5, but they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. Now, what is the feast? It was the feast of Passover. The feast of Passover will last 7 days. For some people who live a little further out, it'd be 8 days for them. There was an allowance for that. And so the religious leaders are saying, we're going to arrest Jesus, and we're going to kill Jesus. But we can't do it during the Feast of the Passover. The Feast of the Passover is going to start in 24 hours. And then it's going to go another 7 days or so from them. So the religious leaders are saying, there's no way we're crucifying this Jesus for probably another 8 or 10 days at least. But Jesus just told his disciples, I'm going to be crucified in 2 days. Now, who's going to be right about this? You know who's going to be right about this because this is God's plan. It is God's plan that God's Son would be the Lamb of God that is slain for our sin on Calvary's cross on the day of Passover. In fact, at the very time, 3 p.m., that is the time of the beginning of the evening sacrifices. Every detail of God's plan is coming together. And let me just remind you, all the powerful people in all the world will not put a dent in the plan of God. Not then, not now, not ever. And it's fitting that the high priest is the one who's plotting the assassination of Jesus, is it not? Because it is the high priest that would offer up the lamb on the day of Passover for the forgiveness of the sin of the people. He does not even know it, but 2 days later, when he, in his mind, is murdering Jesus, he is actually carrying out the perfect plan of God. That the Son of God, the Lamb of God, is being lifted up as the promised Messiah and our Passover lamb. So make no mistake about it, this high priest is corrupt to the bone. But the one that he is going to be offering up is without spot. And he's without blemish. So maybe you're wondering, well, why did they change their mind? They didn't want to do this in the middle of the feast. It would cause a big ruckus with the people. So why did they change their mind? Well, there's something unexpected that came up. They had an opportunity that gets presented to them that they just couldn't pass up on. And you're going to see that opportunity show itself in our text here today. So let's get down to verse 6. And this is where it gets interesting because Matthew has just positioned us 48 hours from the crucifixion of Jesus. But now when we get to verse 6, he's going to bounce backwards all the way to the previous Saturday and tell us about something that happened on that Saturday. It's like he's taking us on a flashback. You know, like you're watching a TV show and a movie and sometimes they flash back to something previous. This is sort of what Matthew's doing here. And it's interesting because Mark does the very same thing in his gospel account. He's eyeball deep into the final week of Jesus, but with this very same thing that we're about to read here, Mark reaches back, has a flashback, and he grabs it as well. John gives us the details of this event as well. So what we're going to try to do today is take all three of those accounts, Matthew and Mark and John, and pull from all of those about what is obviously something incredibly important that happened on the last Saturday of the life of Jesus. We're going to pay attention to that today. Look at verse 6. Matthew, we're going to read his account, then we'll weave the others into the story with us, okay? Matthew says in verse 6, "Now when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask or a jar of very expensive ointment, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant. They were angry, frustrated, upset, saying, 'Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor.' But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, 'Why do you trouble the woman? For she's done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her.' And here we are today, telling it again. Verse 14, "Then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priest and said, 'What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?' And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him." And that's why the religious leaders changed their timing. That's why they bumped it up from 8 days to 2, because this opportunity presented itself. Now listen, the first thing that I want us to see this morning here is that this is Simon's supper. You note takers, you can write that down. This is Simon's supper, not Simon Peter. Simon Peter lives way up in Capernaum to the north. This is happening in Bethany, just outside the big city of Jerusalem. This is happening at a man's house named Simon. Verse 6 tells us what his last name is. Now, when Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, wasn't officially his last name, but it seems to become a last name that sort of stuck. How would you like to have that as your last name? Adam the leper, right? Adam the guy with an infectious disease. Nobody wants to have that as their last name. Simon the leper. Here's what's cool though. It describes what Simon was, but not what Simon is. How many of you this morning say, praise be to God, who I was is not who I am? Jesus has made a difference. Now listen, if you kind of grew up in the church and maybe you trusted Christ to save you at an early age, maybe you don't see a dramatic difference in your life, but think about it over the long haul, right? Like your retirement account goes up or your mortgage goes down. Over the long haul, it changes drastically, doesn't it? And some of you have been being changed by the grace of God drastically and dramatically over a long period of time. Some of you were in darkness just last month, but you gave your life to Jesus, and there's been a dramatic change instantly. But he's in the business of changing all of us. Simon he's been changed by Jesus. He once had this dreaded disease called leprosy. It was a horrible disease, young people. It was horrible. It was terrible what it would do to a person's body, to their overall health, to their lifespan. It was also terrible because if you got leprosy, then you were kicked out of society because it was so contagious. It was so dangerous. Any of you young people back during COVID, y'all were little back then, but any of y'all ever get quarantined up during COVID? That stunk, didn't it? Hated that. Well, listen, with leprosy, you didn't just quarantine for 7 days or 10 days. It was the rest of your life. You didn't see your family anymore. You didn't see your friends anymore. You were outside of all of that. So the fact that Simon the leper is now hosting a dinner party in his home at Bethany is telling us something has happened in Simon's life. He no longer has leprosy. Boys and girls, what do you think happened to Simon's leprosy? Jesus healed his leprosy, right? He's not sick anymore. Now he's throwing a party in the honor of Jesus at his home. He's opened up his home to Jesus, and he's invited Jesus and a lot of other friends to come in so they can enjoy this Jewish day that they celebrate, that they love so much, called Sabbath. And by the way, this will be the last Sabbath under the Old Covenant system. By the time the next Sabbath begins at sundown the following Friday, Jesus will have completed all of his work on the cross, and he would have initiated in the new covenant. I think it's beautiful that Jesus decides that he's going to spend the last Sabbath under the old covenant in the house of a guy that once had no place in society. The heart of Jesus, man. The way he cares, the kindness, and his compassion. He wasn't hobnobbing with Caiaphas and the chief priests and the elders on the last Saturday, the last Sabbath before he goes to the cross. He's hanging out with Simon at his house. I love that. Secondly, notice that Matthew tells us this is happening in Bethany. And Mark and John, in their account of this, they remind us that a man named Lazarus also lived in Bethany. It's his hometown. John takes it a step further, and he explicitly tells us Lazarus was actually at this dinner in Simon's home. Which means here we have Simon's supper, number one, and two, we have Lazarus' story. Lazarus' story. I'm going to skip over to John 12, verse 1. The Bible says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Look, Simon wasn't the only guy that had a last name. Apparently, Lazarus picked up a last name. Lazarus' last name became Lazarus, the man whom Jesus raised from the dead. I love that. What a last name to have, right? I love that. You know what's cool about that? You don't find a period behind the name Lazarus. It's not Lazarus, period. There's always a comma. Death tried to put a period But God intended to only put a comma. There's been a lot of funerals here lately in our church family. Here's good news for us this morning. Saints, if you're grieving this morning, here's good news. We don't grieve like those who have no hope. Because death for a believer is not a period, it's a comma. It's not over. It's definitely not over. So can you imagine being in Simon's house at this dinner party? The dude that had been kicked out of everything because he was sick and dying. Now he's throwing a party. Simon the leper's house. And none other but the famous, and he is famous by this time. In fact, Lazarus is so famous that the Bible tells us the same people that were plotting to kill Jesus are now plotting to kill Lazarus. Because of his testimony, so many people are becoming followers of Jesus. So he's a celebrity. He's been raised from the dead. Can you imagine? Like, I don't know what you'd have to do to get an invite to get to that dinner party. But man, to be at Simon the leper's house and Lazarus is there in that place as well. Just 2 or 3 weeks earlier, Lazarus was dead as a hammer. And now he's eating cornbread. Okay, probably not cornbread, but if it was in my house, we'd be eating cornbread, all right? And some vegetable soup, and who knows. I got soup on my brain this week, y'all. How many of y'all got a pot of soup going today? I know, I see all those hands. That's how we roll down here in the South when it gets cold. Here's this dinner party, right? A guy that was dead and now alive, a guy that had leprosy and now is healed. Don't you see Jesus has given us a little foretaste of what heaven's going to be like? Heaven's going to be a place where the healed and the resurrected sit down at the table with Jesus forever. And can you imagine the stories being told around that table? Simon says, man, let me tell you what it was like living in that leper colony all those years. And Lazarus is going, okay, let me tell you what it was like in heaven for 4 days. I love that Brian Regan bit where he talks about, I walked on the moon. I don't know if y'all like that comedian, Brian Regan. Brian Regan tells this bit where, at a dinner party, there's always that guy trying to top everybody's story, but he said, can you imagine being at a dinner party with one of the astronauts that actually walked on the moon? That's going to be the guy that always tops your story, right? Only if he came to the dinner party at Simon's house, Lazarus is topping that story. The guy goes, well, I walked on the moon. And Lazarus goes, well, I was in heaven for 4 days. Hard to beat that. I don't think there was any way you could get Lazarus to stop talking. I wouldn't. You put me in heaven for 4 days. You let me see all those people that I've known and loved. You let me see Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I'm going to wear your ears out, Bubba, when I come back. And don't you know Lazarus was just going on and on, over and over to anybody that would listen. So what do we have at this place? We got Simon's supper. We got Lazarus' story. And then we have Martha. We have Martha's service. Martha and Mary are the sisters to Lazarus. And Martha, if you're familiar with the story of Martha and Mary, Martha is the one that drank way too many energy drinks probably, right? She was hyper, man. She wasn't just hyper, she was passionate and she was devoted about serving. She had a heart to serve others. John chapter 12, verse 2, same dinner party. This is how John describes it. He was there also. He says, so they gave a dinner for him, that's Jesus there. Martha served. Clear. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining with him at the table. Serving is what Martha is known for in our scriptures. At another gathering, you might remember with Jesus, she got kind of aggravated. She got bent out of shape because she's sweating, man. She's hustling, trying to put on the Ritz for Jesus and the people at the dinner party, and her sister is just sitting there hanging out with Jesus. And she's miffed about that. She thinks my sister ought to get herself up and lift a finger and help me out. And she's just stewing in that, right? Just kind of boiling, and it's escalating, blood pressure's rising. And she finally, I know none of you ladies ever do this, but she finally just let it loose, right? On Jesus. She snitches on her sister and says, you need to tell my sister to get up and help. And Jesus says, Martha, hey, essentially, I think he said, Martha, I really appreciate so much what you're doing, but you know, right now, what your sister's doing is actually better because she's just spending time with me. And I think Martha learned from that. I do. I think Martha learned to worship, connect, serve, right? I think she learned that. She loved to serve. And that's such a great thing. She was a doer. She couldn't sit still. Remember when Jesus didn't show up on time for Lazarus when he was sick and dying? One of the sisters sprinted down the road to meet Jesus. You want to take a guess which one that was? That was her. That was Martha. She's always on the move. And now she's not even at her own house. She's at somebody else's house, as if it was her own. She's serving there in the house of Simon, serving Jesus, serving all of these people that Jesus has touched and helped and healed and forgiven and restored and redeemed and given life to in some way. And she is thrilled to be serving, man. She is happy. She is happy to be preparing the food and setting the table and bussing the tables and cleaning up. She's in her zone. She reminds me of many Grace Life people. Man, this is a serving bunch of people at Grace Life. Listen, if you're part of this church family and you ain't serving, what is wrong with you, man? All the cool kids are doing it. I'm telling you, man, pound for pound, there's not another church I can't imagine that serves the Lord with more joy and more gladness than this church. A lot of Martha kind of people around here, and I'm so thankful for that. You know, Martha's a picture of what every believer should be. We all should have a joyful passion to serve Jesus and to serve each other. So what do we have? We have Simon's supper. We have Lazarus' story. We have Martha's service. Number 4, we have Mary's sacrifice. Here comes Martha's sister, Mary. Now look, Matthew and Mark, they tell us there's a woman that comes with a big helping of this expensive perfume and pours it out on Jesus. They just say it's a woman. But John gives us a few more details, and he tells us that it's Mary. Here's how John tells it, John chapter 12, verse 3. Mary, therefore, took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard. And by the way, nard it comes from a root. It's a very rare root that can only be found in India. You can still order nard from India today. For somebody in Bethany to have a pound of that fragrance that's come from a rare root all the way in India, that came at tremendous expense. It says she took that and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. Unlike Lacey got to me over there, I was about to baptize people. She said, "Oh, I forgot to bring you a towel." Mary might have gotten to the dinner party and went, "Oh, I forgot to bring a towel." So she just made do with what she had. She's just using her hair. And the Bible says the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So you got this dinner party going on in the house of a guy that had leprosy. A former dead guy is there. The long-awaited Messiah is there. His ragtag group of disciples are there. And no telling what other interesting characters are around that table. And in the middle of this, Mary pulls out this jar, this beautiful jar, and it's filled with a pound of nard. I've smelled nard. It's got a very distinct smell to it. It's strong. It's going to stick with you for some time. And she pulls out this jar of perfume. And that wouldn't be an unusual act at a dinner party in Jesus' day. Because hygiene then, not quite like hygiene is now. So you might get a dinner party, and somebody at the dinner party is kind of making it a little more difficult to eat your dinner, right? And so it wouldn't be unusual if somebody in the home would just go up to the shelf and pull down a little jar of perfume and, hey, a little dab for you, a little dab for you, a little 2 dabs for you, That wouldn't be unusual to do that. But that's not what Mary does. Mary takes all of this. And the Bible says that she pours it all on Jesus, all of it. She doesn't share a drop of it with anybody else. It all goes straight to him. And it wasn't because he smelled the worst. It's because she knows clearly who he is and what's about to happen. And she pours it all out on Jesus. John says that she poured it on his feet. Where's Levi? Levi, this young man right here, he's a senior at Pelham High School. He's one of the deepest thinkers I've ever known, and curious and inquisitive and loves God's word. And he pelts me with the hardest Bible questions all the time. And it would be Levi would say this. He said, well, John would say she poured it on his feet, but Mark said she poured it on his head. And Levi will probably ask me, is that a contradiction, Pastor Joel, in the Bible? How do we resolve that? And I would say, no, Levi, it's not a contradiction. I think she poured it on his head and it went all the way to his feet, don't you think, right? From head to toe, this is where it all went. What in the world is she doing? A little dab would do you, but she's going all out with it. And this aroma, it is strong and it is thick and it fills the room and it probably carried out into the streets and it's all over Jesus. And he's going to smell like this for days. The entire week of the last week of his life. If you walk by Jesus, you're going to get a hint, at least, of this fragrance, which is exactly, I think, what Mary wanted to accomplish. What's she doing? She's worshiping. She's loving Jesus. She's worshiping him extravagantly, pouring it all out. I think Mary's worship, in some ways, is kind of backward looking and isn't ours. Here's what I mean by that. I think a lot of her worship is driven by, as she looks backwards and she remembers when apparently the only man, protector, provider for her and her sister was sick and dying. And not only are they going to lose him, they're going to lose stability and protection and provision and life as they know it. And yet Jesus, when it looked like it was all over and he was dead and gone, Jesus raises him up. And I think that's part of what's driving this extravagant worship. I think part of what's driving this extravagant worship is she knows that not only was her brother resurrected, but so was her hope. So was her life. Her life has been changed, a total reversal of all of her circumstances. And now she's so filled with gratitude and worship. I mean, don't you worship in this room? And sometimes personally alone with the Lord, don't you worship backwards looking sometimes? I mean, maybe today on the first Sunday of 2025, your mind as we were worshiping the Lord in song kind of went back to his faithfulness over 2024. It wasn't an easy year. And there were twists and turns and unexpected things, and there were tragedies and disasters, and there were things that hurt us and shook us and broke our heart. But God is faithful, and he's bringing us through. And doesn't that drive our worship a little bit? And I think it's driving her worship, and she can't contain herself. This is extravagant worship. And she's looked around that room, and every life in that room is like her life. Every life in that room has been dramatically changed by the person of Jesus Christ. A guy that was as good as dead with leprosy is back. A guy that was dead is back. And there's guys who were tax collectors like Matthew or who are now fully devoted followers of Jesus. There's story after story after story. And we're not that different from that dinner party today, are we? Because some of us had been thrown out and forgotten. And Jesus has brought us to the table. We were all deader than Lazarus. We were all dead in our sin and trespasses, but Jesus has brought us to the table. We were all in our sin and our darkness, but by the grace of God, he's brought us all to the table. Look, we don't lack for reasons this morning to give him praise, do we? I mean, simply him and him alone for who he is, that's enough, more than enough. But on top of who he is, there's all the great things that he's done. And she's worshiping Jesus full on. She's not about to attend a gathering that is intended to honor Jesus and not give him her everything. What an example this lady is to us. You know, and sometimes when you really begin to get full on with Jesus, students, everybody, when you really, I'm going to be fully devoted to Jesus. I want to worship Jesus extravagantly. I'm going to love him with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. Just brace yourself, because not everybody's going to get that. Not everybody's going to understand that. Not everybody's going to appreciate that. When Jesus becomes your number one priority and they're not everybody's going to dig that. The Gospels tell us that she started catching some criticism because of her worship, because of her love for Jesus, because of her devotion. The people that were watching began to criticize. You know where it started? From those who were supposed to be closest to Jesus. Isn't that how it gets sometimes? It was the disciples. Matthew 26:8 says, and when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor. John tells us that Judas was actually the one that was kind of behind a lot of this. Judas was the treasurer for the ministry of Jesus. We're told that he was lining his own pockets. That's probably part of what's driving Judas's attitude in this moment. And he stirred the others up to say, how wasteful. This is crazy. What a shame that this is happening. So much money. She could have just poured some of it out, but she's wasted the whole thing. It's a year's worth of wages that she just poured out right here on one person. What a waste. All Mary knows is, he's done so much for me. And yet the greatest thing that he's ever going to do for me, he has yet to do that. And because of what he has done, and because of what he is doing, and because of what he has yet to do, I'm going to give him all my worship. And that ought to be our stance here today, right? Because of all that he has done, and because of all that he is doing, and because of all that he is going to do, I'm not going to hold anything back for my worship of Jesus. But they're not accepting that. Listen, when you really get devoted to Jesus, don't expect the world to stand up and applaud you. It won't happen. The critics are going to get on you. But when that happens to you, do what Mary did. When people don't understand your love for Jesus, do what Mary did. Just keep your head down. Stay humble. And just keep worshiping Jesus. Stay humble, keep your head down, and just keep worshiping Jesus. Don't worry. Don't worry about all that stuff. Don't worry about all those people. Just stay where you are, humble, head down, and just keep worshiping Jesus. Don't get pulled away from that. So we got Simon's supper, Lazarus' story, Martha's service, Mary's sacrifice, quickly Judas' selfishness. Judas is a thief. He's a betrayer. He didn't want Jesus to receive this expensive praise. He had other ideas for it. I wonder today if any of us came to worship. We don't have the food here today, but this is a party to honor Jesus. That's what this is. And I wonder if any of us came here kind of like Judas. We came here to see what we could get out of the party that's for Jesus. I wonder if we came here today really thinking first and foremost about me, about self. Or did we come like Mary today to, Jesus, I just want to pour out everything to you. You are so deserving, so worthy. This is your day. It's for your glory. If you show up at a gathering like this to honor Jesus, and you show up with a critical spirit, you show up with that finger in your heart kind of pointing at everybody else, then you would probably be more comfortable today sitting with Judas than you would sitting with Mary. There's Mary on her knees before the Lord. And there's Judas on his high horse. And I wonder where the Lord sees me and you today. Are we on our knees, humbling ourselves before Him? Or are we on our high horse. Mary's extravagantly worshiping Jesus. He's changed her life, her entire outlook, her value system, everything has been turned right side up. And the world looks at how she loves Jesus, and the world says, that's crazy. To order your life like that, to prioritize your life like that, to make those kinds of choices and decisions, who does that? It's crazy. But when God has really gripped your heart, the way that you look at life and life's price tags, it looks completely different. All that you once thought was valuable no longer seems so valuable compared to Him. And when you turn your eyes on Jesus, the things of earth, they grow strangely dim. They do. When's the last time you just poured everything out to the Lord? When's the last time you just stopped the madness of the merry-go-round that we seem to always be on, and you grabbed Psalm 46:10 and said, I'm going to be still and know that He's God? And just poured out the joy, the sorrow, the praise, the questions, all of it. It's so packed into our hearts and our minds and our lives, and just poured it all out to Jesus, to Him. Maybe not as a perfect act of worship, but at least it's an extravagant act of worship because it's not holding back anything. There's no reservations in this whatsoever. It may not be the prettiest. It may come with the questions and the hurts and the tears and the pain, but it's coming extravagantly because it's every drop of what's in me is coming out on Jesus. When's the last time that we did that? And it doesn't matter what anybody thinks about that or says about that. It's all about Jesus and Him getting the glory. If it requires getting on my knees, I get on my knees. If it requires getting on my face, I get on my face. Our students did that some. And they did that some on our trip in Gatlinburg. And there's something about seeing 44 10th, 11th, and 12th graders getting on their faces before the Lord in worship. There's something about that. There's something about when the people of God, that's a posture that we don't get in near as often as we should. That we get as low as we can so that we might lift Him as high as we can. The world says, what a shame, what a waste. And Jesus looks at that, and Jesus says about her, leave her alone. He says, she's doing a beautiful thing. Jesus didn't throw around the word beautiful a whole lot. But when somebody comes worshiping Him like Mary's worshiping Him, He says, this is beautiful. Here's what we got. We got Simon's supper quickly, Lazarus' story, Martha's service, Mary's sacrifice, Judas' selfishness, and Jesus' support. Verse 10, Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why do you trouble the woman? For she's done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. Is Jesus saying don't help the poor? He's not saying to not help the poor. He's just saying our greatest priority should be to Jesus. Our love and our worship to Jesus will result in helping the poor in the right way. Our first devotion before missions is to love Jesus, to worship Jesus. That'll fuel our missions. That'll fuel our evangelism. That'll fuel all the ministry that we do. Jesus says this is the way it works. He says you'll always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. And pouring this ointment out on my body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. 3 times, 4 times now, Jesus has told His followers, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, and they're not getting it. But Mary seems to see something that nobody else sees. She sees the cross coming. She sees the grave coming. And she worships Jesus in this extravagant way. By the way, I think there's something to note here. Extravagant worship often leads to extravagant revelation. She knows something they don't know, and I think it's rooted and grounded in the fact that her worship is all in on Jesus. There's some things that God's just not going to reveal to us at a casual dinner party. But when we're broken and humbled and on our faces and pouring ourselves out before the Lord, brace yourself. Because that's often when He whispers into the hearts of His people in moments like that. Now, Jesus' disciples should have known this, but they didn't. But Mary's got it, which tells me that when you really get before the Lord in worship, it positions you to understand some things about the Lord more clearly. Mary understands that in just a few days, He's going to break His body for her on that cross. And she breaks open this jar of this expensive perfume to prepare Him for this week and to prepare Him, Jesus said, for His burial. She knows I can't stop Him from dying, but I can prepare Him for His burial. The rest of them are eating and partying and telling their stories as they should. But Mary has looked into the eyes of Jesus and she has seen what they're not seeing yet. She sees Calvary. Do you see Calvary today? See, for her, that was forward-looking worship, but for us, it's backwards-looking worship today, to look back to the cross where Jesus has given His life for us. That's what was fueling that moment for her. That's what ought to fuel our worship of the Lord here today. To see on the cross on which the Prince of Glory died to save sinners like me and you. She pours on Him the only thing that He's going to take to the cross. He will hang with the sin of the world on Him, naked. The only thing He's going to take to the cross except your sin and my sin and the sin of the world is the smell of this perfume that Mary poured out on Him. He'll hang on that cross, Cale. He'll hang on that cross suffering for me and for you, brother, dying for us on that cross. People yelling at Him, mocking at Him, taunting Him. And every once in a while, He'll catch a whiff of that nard and He'll remember Mary. He'll remember why He's on that cross. The comfort that I think that probably brought Him. Let me show you quickly as we close how much this meant to Jesus. Verse 13, He says, "Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." In other words, Jesus said, for the next 2,000 years, this is what I want people to talk about. Why? Why that? Why didn't Jesus say, for the next 2,000 years, I want them to talk about Simon not having leprosy anymore? For the next 2,000 years, I want them to talk about Lazarus being raised from the dead. For the next 2,000 years, I want them to talk about me walking on water. For the next 2,000 years, I want them to talk about how I fed a multitude with a little boy's Lunchable. No, He said, what I want them to be talking about for the next 2,000 years is what this lady just did. Why that? Why that? I'll tell you why. Because that's precisely what every single one of us was born to do. Every single one of us has been born to worship Jesus like that. We all are here on this planet to love the Lord our God. Not with some, but with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength. We're made to worship God like this. He created to love Him like this. Do you know why He created us to love Him like that? AC, it's not because He's some kind of egomaniac, it's like, I gotta have you praising me. No, it's because it's of His love for us. He knows that until our minds and affections are all in on Him, we're missing something. And He loves us too much to let us go through this life missing something. And so He calls us and demands of us that we would love Him with all that we have. Because it is to His glory, but it is also for our joy. Anything short of that, we will miss the heart of God for us. What He desires for us to know and enjoy and experience in this life. He doesn't want us to go through life, Sequoia, with empty hearts and empty souls, hopeless and despairing. The only way to live fully in the purpose with which we have been created is to pour ourselves out to Him fully completely and totally. And I can't imagine a more important place in the book of Matthew for God to place us on the first Sunday of a new year. To call us back to the very foundation, to the very fundamental truth of why we're breathing here today, why our hearts are beating here today. It is for one purpose and one purpose alone, to humble ourselves and to love the Lord our God with everything that we have, to worship Him extravagantly. Mary's heart had been gripped by Jesus, and I pray this morning that our hearts have been gripped by Jesus. And if your heart has been gripped by Jesus, then I can't think of a better thing for us to do for the next couple of minutes than just to worship Jesus. So can I invite you to bow your heads? Maybe this morning, as we kind of are resetting a lot of things, the first thing that's got to reset is our hearts, our minds, and worship to the Lord. And maybe this morning, like our students did the other night, maybe if you can get to the altar and you just want to get low before the Lord, come on. You want to get on your knees and on your face? You can do that here. You can bury your face in your hands right there in your seat. Get low before the Lord. And let's ask the Lord to change us on this first Lord's Day of this year and to make us extravagant worshipers of the only one who's worthy